In the noisy mythology of New York's underworld, power is usually loud. It announces itself through flashy suits, expensive cars parked crookedly at the curb, whispered nicknames, and reputations sharpened by violence. But every era of organized crime also produces men who operate in the opposite direction, figures who move without spectacle, whose authority is felt rather than seen. Andrew Russo belonged to that second category. He was not a headline gangster. He was not a street legend told in bars, yet in the 1990s, when New York's crime families were fighting to survive under unprecedented federal pressure, Russo represented a quieter, more dangerous kind of power. This story is not about glorifying crime. It is about understanding how influence works when it hides behind calm voices, patience, and long memories. It is a cautionary story meant to educate, not celebrate. Because men like Andrew Russo did not rise through luck alone, they rose through choices, and those choices always carried consequences. Russo grew up in a New York that was still shaped by old loyalties. Neighborhoods were tightly knit, identities were inherited, and respect was currency. In Italian-American communities, especially those connected to organized crime, reputation mattered more than noise. The men who survived longest were rarely the ones who talked the most. They were listeners, observers, men who understood timing. From early on, Russo learned to blend into his surroundings. He did not stand out as a reckless kid chasing attention. He learned the value of being forgettable. In a world where law enforcement watched everything, invisibility could be power. While others chased quick money or violent recognition, Russo focused on relationships, who trusted whom, who owed favors, and who talked too much. By the time the 1990s arrived, New York's mafia landscape had changed dramatically. Federal prosecutors had become more aggressive. Surveillance technology had improved. Informants were no longer rare, they were expected. Long prison sentences under RICO laws meant the old way of doing business was collapsing. Flashy bosses were liabilities now. Loud men attracted cameras, wires, and indictments. This was the environment where Andrew Russo thrived. He was associated with the Colombo crime family, one of the 5 families that had shaped organized crime in New York for decades. The Colombos, once known for internal chaos and violent power struggles, entered the 1990s weakened and divided. Leadership instability made discretion essential. Any men who wanted to survive had to understand one truth: survival now depended on silence. Russo's strength was his temperament. He didn't rush decisions. He didn't escalate conflicts unless absolutely necessary. While others relied on intimidation, he relied on predictability. People knew that if Russo gave his word, he meant it. That reputation alone reduced the need for violence. In organized crime, violence often signals failure to control situations through respect. He focused on earning quietly. Construction-related rackets, labor influence, and low-profile business interests formed the backbone of his world. These were not glamorous operations, but they were effective. They produced steady money without drawing attention. Russo understood that the safest crimes were the ones that looked like normal business disputes from the outside. Law enforcement had a harder time building cases against men like him. There were no dramatic wiretap recordings of screaming threats, no public outbursts, no street-level chaos. Russo conducted himself like a corporate manager more than a traditional gangster. Meetings were brief. Instructions were indirect. He rarely placed himself at the center of anything illegal, but quiet does not mean harmless. Behind that calm exterior was a man deeply embedded in a criminal system that harmed communities, distorted economies, and enforced silence through fear. The damage caused by organized crime is often invisible at first. It shows up in inflated construction costs, lost jobs, unsafe working conditions, and neighborhoods where legitimate businesses can't compete. During the 1990s, as New York tried to clean itself up, men like Russo represented the hardest challenge for authorities. They were the evolution of organized crime, less violent, more calculated, and more difficult to dismantle. Every time a loud boss went to prison, someone quieter stepped forward. Russo's rise was not accidental. It was the result of patience and adaptability. He watched others fall and learned from their mistakes. Where some men saw loyalty as blind obedience, Russo saw it as mutual benefit. Where others demanded respect, he earned it slowly. Yet no criminal system is immune to pressure. Even the most careful operators leave traces. Even the quietest men depend on networks that eventually crack. The same discipline that protects power can also isolate it. Trust becomes thinner. Conversations become shorter. Every knock on the door feels heavier. What makes Andrew Russo's story important is not that he succeeded, but that his success was temporary. Organized crime does not offer real security, no matter how smart or restrained someone appears. The system feeds on itself until it collapses under its own weight. For every year of quiet control, there is a growing risk that one decision, one associate, or one recorded conversation will unravel everything. This is the lesson modern audiences often miss. Crime does not fail because criminals are stupid. It fails because it is unsustainable. It requires constant secrecy, constant fear, and constant compromise. The calm on the surface hides stress underneath. As the 1990s progressed, the walls around New York's underworld grew tighter. Prosecutors learned to target financial patterns instead of street violence. Informants were protected better. Sentences grew longer. The era of quiet hands was coming to an end. Andrew Russo stood at the center of that transition, a symbol of how organized crime tried to evolve and why it ultimately couldn't escape accountability. This story is meant to slow the listener down, not excite them, to show how power without morality leads to isolation, not freedom, and to remind us that the quietest paths into crime are often the hardest to walk away from. In the next part of this story, the focus will shift deeper into the environment that shaped Russo's decisions, the rules, pressures, and silent agreements that defined his world. In the world Andrew Russo moved through, rules were rarely spoken out loud. They weren't written down, debated, or negotiated in the open. They existed in tone, timing, and omission. A pause before answering a question could mean more than a direct refusal. A meeting that ended 5 minutes early could signal approval or danger. This was a universe governed by silence, where understanding the rules meant survival, and misunderstanding them could cost everything. Russo learned early that organized crime was not chaos, it was structure disguised as disorder. From the outside, it looked violent and impulsive. From the inside, it functioned like a rigid hierarchy. Everyone had a role. Everyone had limits. And crossing those invisible boundaries carried consequences that didn't need to be announced. One of the most important rules was restraint. In earlier decades, flamboyance and intimidation had been effective tools. By the time Russo's influence grew, those traits had become liabilities. Attention brought scrutiny, and scrutiny brought indictments. The men who endured were those who mastered emotional control. Anger was weakness. Impulsiveness was dangerous. Talking too much was unforgivable. Russo's reputation for calm wasn't accidental. It was cultivated. He understood that fear was more powerful when it was implied rather than displayed. People feared unpredictability, but they respected consistency. Russo offered the latter. His decisions followed patterns. His reactions were measured. This predictability allowed others to work under him without panic, and that stability strengthened his position. Another unspoken rule was distance. Direct involvement was risky. The closer a person stood to illegal activity, the easier it was to connect them to it. Russo maintained buffers, layers of separation between himself and the actions that produced money. Instructions were delivered indirectly. Messages passed through trusted intermediaries. If something went wrong, the trail didn't lead straight back to him. This wasn't cowardice. It was strategy. Law enforcement had adapted. Wiretaps, surveillance, and cooperating witnesses meant proximity equaled vulnerability. Russo minimized exposure by never being the loudest voice in the room. Often he wasn't the one speaking at all. Trust in this environment was selective and conditional. Loyalty was not emotional, it was transactional. People were trusted because they were useful, careful, or mutually dependent, not because of friendship. Russo understood this distinction better than most. He did not confuse personal feelings with operational necessity. That separation allowed him to make decisions others found difficult. Money followed rules too. Greed was dangerous. Taking too much too fast raised suspicions and created enemies. Russo favored steady income streams that blended into legitimate business activity. Construction, labor influence, and behind-the-scenes negotiations offered exactly that. They produced profits without spectacle and allowed plausible deniability. On paper, things looked normal. In reality, pressure and influence shaped outcomes quietly. But these systems depended on cooperation. Contractors paid because refusing caused delays. Workers complied because alternatives were limited. The harm wasn't immediate or dramatic, it was systemic. Costs rose. Competition shrank. Honest businesses struggled. This is how organized crime damages society most effectively, not through explosions, but through erosion. Russo understood leverage. He knew that the most effective pressure point was rarely violence, it was dependency. When people needed access, approvals, or peace, he controlled the pathway. Once dependency was established, compliance followed naturally. There was no need to threaten. The system enforced itself. Another critical rule involved conflict resolution. Internal disputes were inevitable, but open conflict attracted attention. Russo favored quiet settlements. Problems were discussed privately. Compromises were arranged. If someone became unstable or unpredictable, they were isolated rather than confronted publicly. Stability mattered more than pride. This approach allowed Russo to navigate an underworld filled with paranoia. Informants were everywhere. Every conversation carried risk. Men spoke in half sentences and gestures. Meetings were brief and purposeful. Nothing unnecessary was said. Russo excelled in this environment because he didn't need to dominate discussions. He listened, absorbed, and responded only when required. Yet silence came at a cost. Living this way meant constant vigilance. Every relationship carried suspicion. Every alliance could fracture overnight. The same discipline that protected Russo also trapped him in a narrow existence. There was no room for mistakes, no margin for emotional release. The pressure never turned off. The rule about family was especially strict. Personal lives were meant to remain separate, untouched by business. But in reality, separation was imperfect. Stress bled into homes. Absence became routine. Trust issues followed. Many men in this world believed they were protecting their families by keeping secrets, but those secrets created distance that never fully healed. Russo appeared to accept this trade-off. He prioritized control over comfort, privacy over intimacy. In doing so, he maintained authority, but at the cost of genuine connection. This is one of the quiet tragedies of organized crime. The illusion of power replaces real fulfillment. As law enforcement pressure increased, another rule became paramount: adaptability. The rules themselves evolved. What worked one year could become fatal the next. Russo paid attention to patterns. He observed arrests, indictments, and betrayals. Every downfall was a lesson. He adjusted behavior accordingly. Some men refused to adapt. They clung to old habits, convinced that tradition would protect them. Those men became examples. Russo learned from them without comment. Survival required letting go of nostalgia. The past was dangerous. Despite all precautions, risk never disappeared. The system depended on human beings, and human beings make mistakes. Someone always talked too much. Someone always needed money. Someone always believed they were smarter than the system. Russo could manage risk, but he couldn't eliminate it. This is the paradox at the heart of organized crime. Control is never complete. Power is always temporary. The rules that sustain the system also reveal its fragility. Silence can protect, but it can also isolate. Discipline can preserve order, but it can't stop time. Russo's world demanded constant calculation. Every decision balanced reward against exposure. Every alliance was temporary. Every quiet success carried the seed of future collapse. This wasn't freedom, it was containment disguised as authority. For viewers, the lesson is clear. Crime doesn't just break laws, it reshapes lives around fear and limitation. The rules that seem to offer protection ultimately create cages. The silence that feels powerful eventually becomes heavy. And while men like Andrew Russo mastered these rules for a time, the system they served was already working against them. The quieter it became, the more pressure built beneath the surface waiting for release. In the shadowed economy where Andrew Russo operated, legitimacy and illegality often wore the same face. Office buildings, construction sites, union halls, and backroom meetings formed the landscape of his daily life. Nothing about these places screamed crime. That was the point. The most effective operations looked ordinary, even boring, to anyone passing by. Power hid behind paperwork, contracts, and quiet agreements that never appeared in writing. Russo understood that the future of organized crime depended on appearing lawful. Violence had become inefficient. Every confrontation increased the chance of surveillance, informants, and arrests. Business, on the other hand, offered camouflage. Invoices, negotiations, and partnerships created layers of legitimacy that blurred the line between legal commerce and criminal influence. Construction was especially valuable. Large sums of money moved through it. Timelines were flexible. Disputes were common and often resolved privately. Russo didn't need to control every job, he only needed influence at key points. A delayed permit here. A favored contractor there. Subtle pressure applied in the right place could reshape outcomes without leaving fingerprints. Labor influence worked the same way. Officially, unions existed to protect workers. Unofficially, control over labor meant control over schedules, costs, and access. Russo never needed to shout or threaten. A strike that never happened. A grievance that quietly disappeared. A job that suddenly reopened. These were the currencies of quiet power. Money flowed steadily through these channels, not in dramatic bursts but in reliable streams. That reliability mattered. Sudden wealth drew attention. Slow accumulation blended into normal business success. Russo favored patience over excess. He understood that lasting influence came from consistency, not spectacle. Meetings were structured carefully. Locations changed. Times were precise. Conversations stayed focused. There was no storytelling, no bragging. Each interaction had a purpose. When that purpose was served, the meeting ended. Lingering created risk. Russo's discipline in this area earned him respect from people who valued survival over ego. Trust was built through performance, not promises. Someone who delivered consistently earned more responsibility. Someone who hesitated or caused complications was quietly removed from sensitive roles. Russo didn't announce these decisions, he adjusted access. Information stopped flowing. Invitations ended. In this world, exclusion was often worse than confrontation. Financial discipline extended beyond earning. Spending habits mattered. Flashy lifestyles attracted curiosity. Russo avoided unnecessary attention. His outward appearance suggested moderation, even restraint. This wasn't about humility, it was camouflage. The less interesting someone looked, the less interesting they became to investigators. Yet behind closed doors, the pressure was constant. Every deal carried risk. Every partner had motives. Russo balanced cooperation with caution. He never assumed loyalty was permanent. Contingency planning was second nature. If one stream dried up, another was ready. If one relationship failed, alternatives existed. This adaptability made him effective, but it also deepened dependence on the system. The more successful these operations became, the harder it was to step away. Legitimate exits were rare. Walking away meant leaving money, influence, and protection behind. Few people in this world believed that was possible. Russo's approach minimized chaos, but it didn't eliminate harm. Construction costs inflated. Opportunities narrowed. Honest workers paid the price through limited choices and unfair conditions. The damage was distributed quietly across communities. No single victim could point to one moment of loss, but collectively, the impact was significant. Law enforcement struggled with this form of crime because it lacked drama. There were no bodies, no weapons, no dramatic crimes caught on tape. Everything looked like business disputes and contractual disagreements. Building cases required patience and financial analysis. Russo relied on that difficulty, but time favors exposure. Patterns emerge. Financial inconsistencies accumulate. Someone makes a mistake. Someone else decides cooperation is safer than silence. No system built on secrecy remains sealed forever. Inside this world, paranoia grew slowly. Not the frantic kind, but the persistent kind. Every unexpected call raised questions. Every delay felt suspicious. Russo compensated by tightening controls, limiting communication, and reducing unnecessary contact. The quieter things became, the more tense they felt. This tension shaped behavior. Decisions grew more conservative. Risk tolerance dropped. The environment that once rewarded subtlety began to feel restrictive. Business continued, but the margins narrowed. Opportunities required more effort for less return. The system was aging. For viewers, this chapter of the story offers an important lesson. Crime does not disappear when it becomes quieter, it becomes more deceptive. It hides in processes people take for granted. It embeds itself in structures that seem legitimate. And because it lacks obvious villains, it's harder to confront. Russo's career illustrates this transformation. He wasn't chasing chaos, he was managing it. But management is not control. It's temporary stability eventually. External forces loss, economics, human error disrupt even the most careful arrangements. The illusion of safety that business provides is seductive. It convinces people they've outgrown risk, that they've professionalized wrongdoing. But the foundation remains unstable. The same secrecy that protects operations also prevents accountability and correction. Russo's world thrived on closed doors, but closed doors also limit vision. They prevent new ideas, honest feedback, and change. Over time, the system becomes rigid. When pressure increases, rigidity breaks. This story is not about intelligence or competence. It's about choices. Russo chose efficiency over legality, control over transparency. Those choices created short-term stability and long-term vulnerability. For anyone watching, the takeaway is clear. There is no such thing as safe crime. There is only delayed consequence. The quieter the operation, the longer it may take, but the ending remains the same. In the 1990s, New York was no longer the city it had been in earlier decades. The atmosphere had shifted. Law enforcement was more coordinated, more patient, and more aggressive. Prosecutors weren't chasing headlines anymore. They were building long cases designed to dismantle entire networks. For men like Andrew Russo, this change created a new kind of pressure, one that didn't announce itself loudly but closed in slowly from every direction. The streets felt calmer, but that calm was deceptive. Behind it were task forces, financial analysts, and informants quietly mapping relationships. Surveillance wasn't always visible. Sometimes it was just a parked car that stayed too long, a familiar face that suddenly stopped showing up, a phone that went silent. Russo understood these signals. He had learned to read absence as carefully as presence. Adaptation became essential. Meetings grew shorter and less frequent. Messages were simplified. Anything unnecessary was eliminated. Russo reduced exposure not just for himself, but for those around him. The fewer people involved, the fewer mistakes could be made. This tightened structure protected operations, but it also increased strain. Fewer participants meant more responsibility concentrated in fewer hands. The pressure didn't come only from outside. Inside the underworld, uncertainty bred instability. People worried about who might cooperate with authorities. Old alliances weakened. Loyalty became harder to measure. Fear didn't always produce silence, it sometimes produced panic. Russo had to manage these internal tensions carefully. Overreaction could cause collapse just as easily as inaction. Financial pressure added another layer. Costs rose. Opportunities shrank. Competition intensified as groups fought over fewer reliable income streams. Russo resisted reckless expansion. He preferred consolidation, even if it meant reduced profits. Survival mattered more than growth. This conservative approach frustrated some associates, but it also prevented unnecessary exposure. Still, no amount of caution could eliminate stress. The mental toll was constant. Every decision carried weight. There were no small mistakes. One misjudgment could unravel years of careful work. Russo compensated by slowing everything down. He believed that time favored those who waited. Law enforcement strategy relied on patience too. Instead of immediate arrests, authorities watched patterns. They tracked finances. They waited for leverage. This waiting game created tension on both sides. Russo knew that every day without action wasn't safety, it was preparation. The human element remained the weakest link. Someone always faced personal pressure, debt, fear, family concerns. Russo tried to identify vulnerabilities early. He limited sensitive information shared with anyone showing signs of instability. But predicting human behavior is never exact. Trust could fracture suddenly. Isolation increased. Russo narrowed his circle. Fewer conversations meant fewer risks, but also fewer perspectives. Decision-making became more solitary. This isolation reinforced authority but reduced adaptability. When leaders stop hearing dissent, blind spots grow. The pressure reshaped daily routines. Movements became predictable by necessity, not habit. Familiar places felt unsafe. Normality became rare. Russo lived in a state of controlled vigilance, always alert but never reactive. It was exhausting, but he believed composure was his advantage. Community impact deepened quietly. As criminal influence struggled to maintain control, legitimate systems felt strained. Projects stalled, jobs disappeared. Corruption left gaps that weren't easily filled. The cost of this pressure wasn't limited to criminals, it rippled outward. For viewers, this phase of the story reveals how systems collapse under sustained pressure, not through sudden explosions, but through fatigue. The longer stress persists, the more likely errors become. Even the most disciplined individuals are human. Russo's experience highlights a fundamental truth. Power gained through secrecy demands constant defense. There is no rest. There is no off switch. The very skills that create control, caution, restraint, calculation also drain energy and clarity over time. The city around him continued to change. New generations cared less about old rules. Technology altered communication. The environment that once rewarded patience now demanded adaptation at a faster pace. Russo adjusted, but each adjustment narrowed options further. Eventually, pressure reaches a tipping point. Not because someone gives up, but because the system can no longer absorb stress without cracking. Russo sensed this long before anything became public. He understood that silence was growing heavier, not safer. This chapter of the story isn't about collapse yet, it's about the weight that precedes it. The invisible force that shapes decisions and limits choices. The kind of pressure that doesn't break immediately but ensures that when something does happen, the impact will be decisive. For the audience, the lesson remains consistent. Crime doesn't fail because criminals stop trying. It fails because the cost of maintaining control eventually exceeds the benefits. Pressure exposes the truth behind the illusion of power. Silence, for Andrew Russo, was never empty. It was heavy, deliberate, and expensive. Every word left unsaid carried intention, and every conversation avoided carried consequence. In the world he navigated, quiet was not peace, it was maintenance. It demanded effort, sacrifice, and constant vigilance. Over time, that cost began to surface in ways that could not be hidden behind discipline or control. Russo understood that staying quiet was not simply about avoiding law enforcement. It was about managing perception from every direction. Associates watched for weakness. Rivals watched for opportunity. Outsiders watched for mistakes. Silence became a shield, but shields grow heavier the longer they are held. The personal cost was the first to appear. Relationships outside the business were limited by necessity. Honest conversation was dangerous. Transparency was impossible. Even moments meant to feel normal carried underlying tension. Russo lived with a divided identity, one face for the world, another for the closed rooms where decisions were made. That division never fully rested. Inside the organization, silence created distance. Leadership requires connection, but secrecy restricts it. Russo maintained authority through consistency, not warmth. People respected him, but few felt close to him. Respect ensured obedience, distance ensured safety. Yet this same distance reduced loyalty's depth. When loyalty becomes conditional, it weakens under pressure. Silence also distorted time. Days blurred into routines governed by caution. The absence of open conflict didn't mean calm, it meant suppression. Problems weren't resolved, they were postponed. Tension accumulated quietly, waiting for release. Russo managed this by controlling tempo. He slowed processes, delayed decisions, and avoided escalation. Delay felt safer than resolution. Financially, silence had its own price. Concerted operations limited growth. Missed opportunities accumulated. While others chased expansion and visibility, Russo chose stability. This protected him from sudden collapse, but also narrowed margins. The system survived, but it no longer thrived. Associates noticed this restraint. Some interpreted it as wisdom. Others saw it as stagnation. Ambition doesn't disappear just because it's discouraged. It relocates. Russo had to watch for subtle shifts, changes in tone, reduced enthusiasm, increased questioning. None of it was explicit. It didn't need to be. In a silent world, implications spoke loudly. Externally, the environment grew less forgiving. Law enforcement pressure didn't ease, it refined itself. Investigators learned to interpret silence too. Lack of communication became a signal. Predictable restraint created patterns. Russo adjusted continually, but adaptation itself became a source of stress. Constant change without relief erodes clarity. The psychological toll was cumulative. Decision fatigue set in. Every choice required evaluation of risk, exposure, and consequence. There were no instinctive actions. Everything was calculated. This level of control is unsustainable indefinitely. Human judgment weakens under constant strain. Silence also complicated trust. Trust requires disclosure. Without it, assumptions fill the gap. Russo trusted very few, and those he trusted bore heavy responsibility. Any failure felt amplified. When something went wrong, even minor, the response was internalized. Doubt replaced confidence. In quieter moments, the weight of choices surfaced. Russo had built a life around avoidance, avoiding attention, avoiding mistakes. avoiding vulnerability. That avoidance shaped his identity. It became difficult to imagine alternatives. The path chosen narrowed perception. Other ways of living felt distant, unrealistic. The irony was clear. Silence had protected Russo from immediate danger, but it had also isolated him from support. There was no space for honesty, reflection, or relief. The system demanded composure at all times. Cracks were unacceptable. For the people around him, this environment produced mixed reactions. Some felt safe under predictable leadership. Others felt constrained. Creativity and initiative were limited by fear of missteps. Over time, the organization became cautious to a fault. Caution prevented disaster, but it also prevented renewal. Communities affected by these operations continued to feel quiet harm. Projects stalled not from chaos, but from indecision. Opportunities vanished not from violence, but from hesitation. Silence spread outward, affecting people far removed from Russo's inner circle. The lesson here is subtle but critical. Crime doesn't only damage through action, it damages through suppression. When systems operate on secrecy, everything slows, progress halts, growth becomes impossible. Silence preserves the status quo until the status quo collapses. Russo's discipline kept him standing, but standing still in a moving world is dangerous. Change doesn't wait. External forces continued to evolve. Technology advanced. Laws tightened. Cultural attitudes shifted. The space available for quiet manipulation shrank. At some point, silence stops being a choice and becomes a habit. Habits are hard to break. Russo's identity had become inseparable from restraint. Even when opportunities arose to adjust course, the instinct was to minimize movement. Safety had become synonymous with stillness. This chapter of the story isn't about downfall. It's about erosion. The slow wearing away of flexibility, connection, and resilience. The cost of staying quiet is rarely paid all at once. It's deducted gradual, unnoticed, until the balance runs low. For viewers, the message is important. Silence can feel powerful, but it is not freedom. It limits growth. It isolates decision makers. It delays reckoning but never prevents it. The longer silence is maintained, the louder the eventual consequences become. Andrew Russo mastered quiet, but mastery does not equal escape. It only postpones the moment when silence is no longer enough. From the outside, Andrew Russo's world appeared controlled, even stable. Operations continued. Income still arrived. Meetings still happened. But beneath that surface, small cracks had begun to form, subtle, almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore once noticed. These weren't dramatic breaks. They were signs of strain, hesitations where confidence once lived. Delays where decisiveness had ruled, questions left unanswered because answering them felt risky. The first cracks appeared in communication. Silence had always been a tool, but now it was becoming an obstacle. Messages took longer to circulate. Decisions stalled. Associates waited for direction that came later than expected. No one openly complained, but uncertainty spread quietly. In an environment built on clarity and hierarchy, uncertainty is corrosive. Russo sensed it. He had always been observant, sensitive to changes in rhythm. The pace of interactions felt different. People spoke more carefully, not out of discipline, but out of anxiety. When fear replaces respect, authority weakens. Russo adjusted by tightening control further, but that only intensified the pressure. Internally, loyalty became harder to measure. In earlier years, consistency had built confidence. Now, consistency felt like rigidity. The world outside was changing faster than the system inside. Younger participants didn't share the same patience or reverence for tradition. They questioned delays. They wanted faster results. Russo viewed this impatience as dangerous, but he also understood it was inevitable. This generational shift created friction. Not enough to cause open conflict, but enough to create distance. Russo responded by limiting access further. Fewer voices, fewer opinions. This preserved order, but it also reduced insight. When leaders stopped hearing dissent, blind spots widened, financial cracks followed. Conservative strategies that once ensured safety now limited adaptability. Margins tightened. Opportunities required more compromise. Russo faced choices he had avoided before, accepting higher risk or accepting diminished returns. Neither option was appealing. The careful balance he had maintained for years was harder to sustain. Externally, pressure intensified in quieter ways. Law enforcement didn't rush. They watched. They waited. Russo felt this attention not through confrontation but through absence. Familiar channels closed. Reliable intermediaries became unavailable. The environment felt thinner, less forgiving. The human cost deepened. Stress accumulated. Sleep shortened. Decision-making demanded more effort. Russo's calm demeanor remained, but internally fatigue grew. Sustained vigilance is draining. Without release, it erodes judgment. Isolation increased. Russo trusted fewer people than ever. Trust, once carefully distributed, became concentrated. This concentration magnified risk. If one trusted individual failed, the impact would be severe. Russo knew this, yet alternatives felt worse. Expanding trust increased exposure. The psychological weight of control became evident in small habits. Repetition increased. Routines became rigid. Flexibility decreased. These patterns offered comfort, but they also signaled entrenchment. When systems become too fixed, they struggle to respond to change. Meanwhile, the broader world continued moving forward. Technology reshaped communication. Surveillance improved. Financial tracking grew more sophisticated. The advantages of subtlety diminished. Silence no longer guaranteed invisibility. Russo adjusted, but adaptation now required more effort for less benefit. Associates noticed the strain. Some responded with increased caution. Others grew restless. Ambition doesn't disappear under pressure, it mutates. Quiet dissatisfaction spread. Russo monitored this carefully, aware that dissatisfaction often precedes mistakes. Mistakes didn't need to be dramatic. A poorly chosen word, a delayed response, an assumption left unchecked. Small errors accumulate. Russo tried to compensate by slowing everything further, but slowing has limits. At some point, hesitation becomes paralysis. The cracks beneath the surface weren't failures of intelligence or discipline. They were symptoms of sustainability reaching its limits. No system built on secrecy and constant control can operate indefinitely without renewal. Renewal requires openness, and openness was incompatible with Russo's world. For the communities affected, these cracks manifested as stagnation. Projects stalled longer. Negotiations dragged on. Opportunities disappeared quietly. The harm continued not through aggression but through inertia. Russo understood that something had shifted. Not a single event, but a gradual realization that the environment no longer rewarded the same strategies. The skills that had brought him stability were becoming constraints. Adaptation now required risk, and risk contradicted everything he had built. This internal conflict defined the period. Move forward and expose vulnerabilities, or remain still and accept decline. Neither option offered security. Russo chose caution, but caution now felt reactive rather than strategic. The lesson here is subtle but powerful. Success achieved through control often resists change. The very habits that create stability can prevent evolution. When the world changes faster than a system adapts, cracks form not from weakness, but from rigidity. Russo's world hadn't collapsed yet, but it was no longer solid. The pressure that once forged discipline now threatened to fracture it. The silence that once protected him now amplified uncertainty. For viewers, this stage of the story highlights an important truth. Decline rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives quietly, through hesitation, fatigue, and narrow choices. Recognizing these signs early is the difference between adaptation and collapse. Andrew Russo stood at that threshold, still composed, still controlled, but facing a reality where quiet mastery was no longer enough. Control is rarely lost all at once. It erodes in small, almost reasonable moments, choices that seem logical in isolation, but dangerous in accumulation. For Andrew Russo, this erosion didn't announce itself with chaos or confrontation. It appeared as compromise. Each compromise felt manageable. Together, they marked a shift from command to containment. The first sign was decision compression. Where Russo once had time to evaluate options calmly, circumstances now demanded faster responses. Pressure shortened windows, delays became risks of their own. Russo still preferred patience, but patience now carried opportunity costs. Acting slowly meant losing leverage. Acting quickly meant increased exposure. The balance that once felt natural now felt forced. As decisions accelerated, delegation increased. Russo had to rely more heavily on others to manage details he once oversaw personally. Delegation brought efficiency, but it also diluted control. Each additional layer introduced interpretation, error, and potential betrayal. Russo mitigated this by selecting only those he considered disciplined and cautious. Even so, no filter is perfect. Communication quality declined subtly. Instructions became more abstract, less precise, designed to avoid explicitness. While this reduced legal risk, it increased operational ambiguity. People filled gaps with assumptions. Assumptions varied. Outcomes became less predictable. Russo noticed this shift and adjusted by clarifying selectively, but selective clarity has limits. Externally, competition intensified. Other groups faced the same pressures and responded differently. Some embraced risk. Others collapsed. The environment became uneven. Russo resisted aggressive expansion, but defensive positioning still required engagement. Avoidance was no longer enough. Maintaining territory, influence, and relevance demanded action. Action brought exposure. Exposure invited scrutiny. Scrutiny heightened anxiety. Russo managed this cycle through discipline. But discipline alone couldn't restore earlier stability. The system had entered a reactive phase. Internally, morale fluctuated. Some associates interpreted Russo's restraint as wisdom under pressure. Others saw it as hesitation. Leadership perception matters. When confidence in direction weakens, cohesion suffers. Russo responded by reinforcing expectations, emphasizing consistency and caution. This reassured some, but frustrated others. The generational divide widened. Newer participants operated in a faster world. They were accustomed to rapid communication and immediate feedback. Russo's deliberate pace felt outdated to them. This mismatch created friction. Russo understood their perspective, but he did not adopt it. He believed speed increased risk. In many ways, he was right. Yet inflexibility also increased risk. Financial flows reflected these tensions. Income remained, but unpredictably. Planning became harder. Long-term projections lost reliability. Russo compensated by tightening reserves and reducing exposure. This preserved stability, but it also signaled contraction. Contraction sends messages. Rivals notice, associates notice. The perception of retreat can invite challenge. Law enforcement pressure continued its steady advance, not dramatic but persistent. Russo felt watched even when nothing happened. This awareness influenced behavior. He reduced visibility further. He avoided routine. He minimized contact. The world narrowed. The psychological effect was cumulative. Sustained pressure alters perception. Threats feel closer. Margins feel thinner. Russo remained composed, but composure required effort. Fatigue set in quietly. Judgment under fatigue is functional, but less creative. Solutions became conservative by default. Control slipping doesn't always mean losing power. Sometimes it means power becomes harder to exercise. Russo still had influence, but using it required more energy. Each intervention cost more. Returns diminished. In response, Russo focused on preservation. He prioritized avoiding damage over pursuing opportunity. Preservation is rational under threat, but it also accelerates decline if maintained too long. Systems that only defend eventually stagnate. The people around him sensed this shift. Conversations became shorter. Feedback became guarded. Initiative declined. When initiative declines, leaders must push or accept inertia. Russo chose caution. He allowed inertia, believing it safer than missteps. Communities affected by these operations felt the consequences indirectly. Delays increased. Projects slowed. Uncertainty spread. The damage remained quiet, but it accumulated. This stage of the story is about limits. The limits of discipline. The limits of silence. The limits of control in a changing environment. Russo had mastered a specific set of skills. The environment that rewarded those skills was disappearing. The lesson here is not that caution is wrong. It's that caution must evolve. When caution becomes resistance to change, it undermines the very safety it seeks to preserve. Russo faced a narrowing path. Adapt and risk exposure, or remain static and risk irrelevance. Neither choice offered certainty. Control had not vanished, but it no longer felt secure. For viewers, this moment illustrates a universal truth. Systems built on control rather than resilience struggle under change. Control manages the present. Resilience prepares for the future. Andrew Russo remained standing, but the ground beneath him was no longer firm. Control was slipping not dramatically, but decisively through compromise, fatigue, and the slow mismatch between past strategy and present reality. There is a moment in every tightly controlled system when awareness becomes a burden rather than an advantage. For Andrew Russo, that moment arrived quietly. He had always relied on observation, watching people, patterns, timing, and reactions. Awareness had kept him alive and effective. But as pressure increased, watching everything began to cost more than it gave. Russo noticed details others missed. A shift in tone during a conversation, a delay in response that felt unnatural, a sudden eagerness that didn't match past behavior. These details once provided leverage. Now they created constant tension. Every observation demanded interpretation, and every interpretation demanded a response. The mental load was relentless. Hyper-awareness changes how time feels. Days stretch under scrutiny. Moments that should pass unnoticed become sources of analysis. Russo found himself replaying conversations, reconsidering choices, questioning assumptions. This wasn't paranoia, it was vigilance pushed to its limit. Vigilance without rest eventually dulls judgment. The need to monitor everything reduced spontaneity. Nothing could happen naturally. Every interaction was filtered through risk assessment. Even neutral events required explanation. Russo's world became smaller, not because options disappeared overnight, but because engaging with them felt dangerous. People around him felt this shift. Conversations lost ease. Even routine exchanges carried tension. When leaders operate under constant watchfulness, that energy spreads. Associates became more cautious, less expressive. Communication narrowed to essentials. Creativity vanished. The system grew quiet in a way that felt heavy rather than controlled. Russo tried to counter this by maintaining structure. He reinforced schedules, routines, and boundaries. Structure provided predictability, and predictability felt safer. But overstructuring has consequences. It reduces flexibility. It discourages initiative. When everything is tightly managed, nothing adapts easily. Externally, the world remained unpredictable. Markets shifted. Regulations tightened. Cultural attitudes evolved. Russo watched these changes carefully, but watching alone didn't provide solutions. It acquired risk. Risk conflicted with preservation. The effort to stay ahead became exhausting. Russo spent more time preventing problems than building anything new. Prevention is necessary, but it is reactive by nature. Over time, reactive systems lose direction. They respond, but they don't lead. Trust eroded further under constant observation. When people feel watched, they change behavior. They hide uncertainty. They avoid responsibility. Russo noticed this, but correcting it required openness, and openness felt unsafe. The cycle reinforced itself. The psychological cost deepened. Sleep was lighter, rest felt incomplete. Even moments of calm carried anticipation. The mind doesn't easily disengage from threat detection. Russo's composure remained intact, but it demanded continuous effort. Awareness also magnified isolation. The more Russo observed, the less he shared. Knowledge became asymmetrical. He knew more than those around him, but sharing knowledge increased risk. This imbalance reinforced authority, but it also separated him further from others. In quieter moments, Russo recognized the irony. Awareness had given him control, but now it limited connection. Control without connection is fragile. It depends entirely on compliance, not commitment. Compliance weakens under pressure. The environment responded accordingly. Small inefficiencies grew. Minor misunderstandings accumulated. Nothing catastrophic happened, but nothing improved either. Stagnation settled in. The communities affected by this system experienced the same stagnation. Delays multiplied. Decisions slowed. Opportunities passed quietly. The harm was subtle, but persistent. Russo understood that watching everything didn't mean understanding everything. Without context can mislead. Patterns can be misread. Assumptions can harden into beliefs. Under constant stress, the mind favors caution, sometimes excessively. The danger of overvigilance is miscalculation. When every signal feels threatening, priorities blur. Russo worked to maintain perspective, but the margin for error had narrowed. Fatigue reduced resilience. This stage of the story illustrates an important lesson. Awareness is powerful, but it must be balanced. Systems that rely solely on monitoring eventually exhaust themselves. Growth requires trust. Adaptation requires risk. Russo had built his identity around control through observation. Letting go of that felt impossible. Yet holding on was becoming unsustainable. the weight of watching everything pressed down on every decision. The future narrowed into a set of difficult choices: reduce awareness and risk surprise, or maintain vigilance and risk exhaustion. Neither option offered relief. For viewers, this chapter speaks to a universal experience. Constant vigilance is not strength, it is strain. Whether in crime, business, or life, systems that never rest eventually falter. Awareness must be paired with renewal, or it becomes a liability. Andrew Russo remained alert, disciplined, and composed. But beneath that surface, the cost of watching everything was becoming impossible to ignore. At a certain point, survival stops being about growth and becomes about selection, not choosing what to pursue, but choosing what to abandon. For Andrew Russo, this stage arrived quietly, without a defining moment. The options around him didn't disappear all at once. They narrowed. Each choice he made closed off another direction until movement itself became constrained. Russo had always understood trade-offs. Every decision involved risk, exposure, and consequence. What changed was scale. The margin for correction had shrunk. Small decisions now carried outsized impact. Avoiding one risk amplified another. Caution became heavier, less flexible. He began prioritizing simplicity. Fewer operations, fewer relationships, fewer variables. Simplification reduced exposure, but it also reduced resilience. Diverse systems can absorb shocks. Narrow systems break under them. Russo accepted this risk because complexity felt more dangerous. Associates adjusted accordingly. Some welcomed the clarity. Others felt constrained. Opportunities that once motivated loyalty disappeared. Ambition sought outlets elsewhere. Russo monitored this carefully, aware that disengagement can precede defection. Externally, the environment continued to tighten. Oversight increased. Informal arrangements became harder to maintain. Russo responded by consolidating control, even as that consolidation reduced adaptability. It was a trade he felt forced to make. The psychological impact of narrowing choices is profound. When options shrink, pressure increases. Decisions feel heavier. Regret becomes more immediate. Russo managed this by focusing on process rather than outcome. He trusted his judgment, even as circumstances challenged it. Isolation deepened. With fewer trusted voices, Russo relied more on internal reasoning. This increased confidence in his own analysis, but it also limited challenge. Without challenge, assumptions go untested. Russo compensated by revisiting decisions repeatedly, but repetition doesn't replace perspective. Financial management reflected this narrowing. Investments favored stability over return. Risk was minimized aggressively. The system became defensive. Defensive systems survive for a time, but they rarely thrive. The human element remained unpredictable. Personal pressures mounted. Associates faced their own limits. Russo couldn't manage every variable. The more he tried, the more apparent those limits became. Communities impacted by these operations felt the effects indirectly. Projects slowed further. Employment became uncertain. The quiet harm continued. The narrowing path created urgency. Russo felt time compress. Decisions couldn't be postponed indefinitely. The longer he delayed adaptation, the fewer options remained. Yet adaptation required risk, and risk contradicted preservation. This internal conflict defined the period. Russo weighed every option against potential exposure. The calculus favored caution, but caution now carried its own danger. The lesson here is about choice architecture. When systems restrict options over time, they eventually force decisions under pressure. Early flexibility prevents late desperation. Russo's disciplined restraint had delayed reckoning, but it couldn't prevent it. For viewers, this chapter highlights a broader truth. Life paths narrow through repetition. The choices we avoid shape our future as much as those we make. Avoidance can feel safe, but it quietly limits possibility. Andrew Russo stood within a corridor of narrowing options, still composed, still controlled, but increasingly constrained by the very strategies that once protected him. Stability is one of the most seductive illusions in any system built on control. It looks like order. It feels like safety. It reassures those inside that nothing urgent needs to change. For Andrew Russo, stability had long been a carefully maintained appearance: smooth operations, predictable routines, and the absence of visible conflict. But by this stage, that stability had become fragile, dependent on constant effort rather than natural balance. From the outside, things appeared steady. Money still moved. Agreement still held. The system hadn't collapsed. That appearance mattered. It reinforced confidence among associates and discouraged challenges from rivals. Russo understood the power of perception. Stability, even if artificial, could buy time. But maintaining that illusion required increasing energy. Every routine needed monitoring. Every relationship required reinforcement. What once functioned through habit now demanded oversight. Russo felt this shift daily. Stability no longer emerged organically. It had to be enforced. The problem with enforced stability is that it masks underlying stress. Tension doesn't disappear, it accumulates. Minor inefficiencies multiplied. Small disagreements lingered unresolved. Russo addressed them quietly, one by one, but resolution became harder. The system's tolerance for disruption had decreased. Financially, the illusion of stability hid declining flexibility. Cash flow was predictable, but constrained. Reserves were protected aggressively. Opportunities that required investment or risk were avoided. This preserved short-term security but limited long-term options. People sense this. When growth stalls, ambition seeks alternatives. Russo noticed subtle disengagement. Participation became transactional rather than invested. Loyalty turned conditional. He responded by reinforcing expectations, but reinforcement without incentive loses effectiveness. Externally, scrutiny intensified. Law enforcement methods continued to evolve. Surveillance became more integrated. Financial analysis more sophisticated. Russo's system relied on appearing ordinary, but ordinary no longer guaranteed invisibility. The margin between normal and suspicious narrowed. The psychological toll deepened. Maintaining composure required continuous effort. Russo's calm remained, but it was sustained rather than natural. Fatigue crept in. Decision-making slowed not from hesitation but from exhaustion. Even simple choices demanded concentration. Isolation became pronounced. Russo had fewer confidence than ever. Conversations were filtered. Emotional expression was limited. This isolation reinforced authority but deprived him of support. Control without support is unsustainable. The illusion of stability also affected judgment. When systems appear stable, urgency diminishes. Necessary changes are postponed. Russo recognized the danger intellectually, but acting on it felt risky. Disrupting stability could trigger the very collapse he wanted to avoid. This is the paradox. Stability can protect, but it can also trap. When maintaining the appearance of order becomes the primary goal, adaptation stalls. Russo found himself defending the present against an uncertain future. The communities affected by this system felt stagnation more than disruption. Progress slowed. Opportunities narrowed. The harm remained diffuse, difficult to attribute, but persistent. Russo's leadership style emphasized control, not inspiration. That approach worked in high-risk environments, but it limited renewal. New ideas were discouraged. Experimentation felt dangerous. The system grew conservative to a fault. As time passed, the cost of maintaining stability rose. Each intervention required more effort for less effect. Russo compensated by tightening controls further. This preserved order, but it increased strain. Strain reduces resilience. For viewers, this chapter offers a critical insight. Stability is not the same as health. Systems can appear stable while decaying internally. Without renewal, stability becomes stagnation. Russo's experience underscores the danger of mistaking absence of crisis for success. Crisis had been avoided, but progress had also been sacrificed. The illusion of stability delayed confrontation, but it couldn't prevent it. The path forward grew more uncertain. Russo understood that the system could continue as it was for a time, but not indefinitely. The longer change was delayed, the harsher it would be when it arrived. This stage of the story is about recognition. Recognizing that what feels safe may be fragile, that what appears controlled may be close to breaking. Russo recognized this, but recognition alone didn't provide a solution. The illusion of stability held, but it demanded constant defense. And defenses, no matter how strong, eventually weaken. In any world governed by secrecy and careful calculation, the most dangerous enemies are often the ones that cannot be seen. For Andrew Russo, these unseen threats were everywhere, hidden in habits, hidden in assumptions, hidden in the very strategies that had kept him alive for decades. Unlike open opposition, they did not announce themselves. They crept in quietly, wearing the guise of normalcy, and by the time their impact was evident, damage was already done. One of the most insidious threats came from within the system itself. People trusted, but trust is fragile. Dependence on associates created pressure points that were invisible until exploited. A single lapse, miscommunication, hesitation, or distraction could ripple outward, subtly undermining the stability Russo had painstakingly built. These were the cracks no one saw until they widened enough to affect operations. Financial systems carried their own unseen risks. Streams of money that appeared stable could be interrupted at any moment. Clients delayed payments, contracts fell through, market conditions shifted. Russo's cautious strategies minimized risk, but caution is never absolute protection. Even carefully monitored cash flow carries uncertainty. A minor disruption might seem insignificant, but small disruptions accumulate faster than anticipated. Another invisible danger lay in the evolving methods of law enforcement. Investigators had become sophisticated, patient, and multidimensional. They did not rely solely on evidence obtained from a single incident. Instead, they studied patterns, inferred relationships, and waited for small mistakes to compound. The slow pressure of scrutiny was invisible day to day, but it steadily narrowed options and increased risk. Every action Russo took was measured against the unseen possibility of detection. Perhaps the most unpredictable threat, however, came from human nature itself. People's priorities change. Their fear of consequences waxes and wanes. Their ambitions rise and fall. A trusted associate might suddenly seek an exit, a safer path, or a bigger cut elsewhere. Motivations shift subtly, often without any explicit warning. Russo had always observed carefully, but even the most observant eye can miss these quiet changes. The unpredictability of human behavior is a constant, silent force. This awareness of unseen threats altered Russo's behavior. He became more cautious, more deliberate, and more analytical. Every conversation, every transaction, every relationship was scrutinized for hidden risks. Control, once exercised with confidence, now required effortful maintenance. Awareness demanded constant evaluation of probabilities, even when outcomes seemed stable. Yet even constant vigilance is limited. Monitoring multiple potential points of failure spreads attention thin. The mind, no matter how disciplined, can only process so much. Cognitive overload becomes a subtle, invisible threat. Misjudgments are more likely when every decision carries weight. Every minor oversight could escalate, creating consequences disproportionate to the original error. The pressure from unseen threats also influenced Russo's relationships. He became more distant, more measured, less willing to delegate. Trust was restricted to a narrower circle. While this minimized exposure to betrayal, it also limited input, slowed operations, and increased responsibility on a few shoulders. When systems depend on fewer individuals, the cost of a single failure grows exponentially. Internally, the tension created by unseen threats weighed heavily. Sleep became lighter, reflection more intense, and caution pervasive. Russo's calm exterior hid an internal network of calculations and contingency plans. He anticipated challenges that no one else saw, prepared for scenarios that might never occur. Yet the mental load remained constant, and fatigue eroded resilience slowly, almost imperceptibly. Communities affected by Russo's operations were rarely aware of these internal struggles, but the consequences were tangible. Projects that might have advanced quickly slowed due to hesitation and overcaution. Opportunities that could have benefited others were overlooked. The unseen pressures that shaped Russo's decisions indirectly shaped the lives of those around him, demonstrating how subtle influence can have wide-ranging effects. In moments of reflection, Russo recognized the paradox of power in a hidden world. Authority depends on perception, control, and influence. Yet the forces that threaten it often cannot be detected until it is too late. Success requires mastery of the visible environment, but survival depends on accounting for the invisible. One cannot confront what cannot be seen, only anticipate, mitigate, and adapt. This chapter demonstrates a critical lesson for viewers. Threats are not always loud, obvious, or immediate. Often they are subtle, quiet, and gradual. They test patience, judgment, and adaptability. The men who survive longest are those who can perceive patterns, anticipate consequences, and act preemptively, even in the absence of clear evidence. Russo's mastery of observation, calculation, and restraint allowed him to navigate these unseen threats effectively for a time. But mastery is never permanence. Systems designed to control uncertainty can delay consequences but cannot eliminate them entirely. The unseen will always exist. It can be managed, but it cannot be removed. The ultimate lesson embedded in this stage of Russo's story is timeless: vigilance protects, but vigilance alone is not sufficient. Awareness of hidden risks must be paired with flexibility, strategic foresight, and the willingness to accept calculated exposure. Otherwise, even the most disciplined individual finds themselves reacting to pressures too late, overwhelmed by forces that were never visible. For Andrew Russo, the quiet threats surrounding him were both the source of his survival and the weight that made continued control increasingly difficult. Every unseen risk demanded attention, every subtle change required adaptation, and every small misstep carried consequences that could ripple through the system in ways that were impossible to fully predict. His world remained orderly on the surface, but beneath it, the cracks of invisible challenges were widening, silently shaping the path forward. In the world Andrew Russo navigated, reputation was as valuable as cash, influence, or alliances. It was a currency that couldn't be deposited in a bank or measured on a ledger, yet it determined the degree of control one held over associates, rivals, and even outsiders. A reputation for fairness, calm, and precision had protected Russo for years, but reputation is fragile. It is a living asset that demands constant maintenance, and maintaining it under pressure is an exhausting task. Russo understood this better than anyone. Reputation was not about appearances alone, it was about consistency. Each interaction reinforced a perception. Every promise kept strength and trust. Every decision made with deliberate control added weight to his authority. To compromise in one area risked diminishing all the others. Reputation was cumulative, built slowly but destroyed quickly. The pressures that threatened his reputation were subtle but persistent. Inside his organization, minor errors could be interpreted as weakness, delays in decision-making, inconsistencies in instruction, or even perceived favoritism could sow doubt. Russo knew that doubt is contagious. One person questioning leadership might lead to whispers, and whispers could escalate into visible fractures. Authority without respect is authority at risk. Externally, competitors tested reputations constantly. In the quiet world Russo inhabited, challenges were rarely overt. They appeared as missed courtesies, delays in communication, or attempts to bypass influence. Each challenge required response, not necessarily confrontation, but a strategic reminder of power. A leader's reputation is as much about deterrence as it is about trust. Maintaining that balance demanded constant attention. Even small miscalculations carried risk. Overreacting to a minor slippage could make Russo appear insecure or impulsive, undermining the calm persona he'd carefully cultivated. Underreacting, however, could signal tolerance for disrespect, inviting further encroachment. The tension between action and restraint defined much of his daily calculation. Every choice was measured against the long-term impact on perception. The human element added complexity. People outside the organization, including labor contacts and business partners, observed Russo's reputation closely. They interpreted pauses, tones, and gestures for clues. A simple nod or hesitation could become a story of intent. This external observation meant Russo's reputation was never just his own. It was co-constructed with those who interacted with him. He had influence, but perception was partially outside his control. The psychological burden of managing reputation was immense. Every interaction, every decision, every word became a potential test. Russo learned to compartmentalize, to analyze outcomes before responding, and to anticipate how others might interpret even minor actions. Over time, this vigilance became instinctive, but instinct has limits. Fatigue, distraction, or overconfidence could erode control. Reputation, though invisible, demanded as much attention as tangible operation. Financial stability intertwined with reputation. Partners and associates often made decisions based on the reliability Russo projected. Maintaining a steady flow of business, honoring agreements, and handling disputes discreetly all reinforced the belief that Russo was both capable and dependable. A reputation for discretion was as vital as a reputation for fairness. A single breach of either could unravel years of trust. The challenges intensified when law enforcement pressure increased. Even without public exposure, rumors or leaks could reach the wrong ears. Reputation needed to serve as armor against both competitors and investigators. For Russo, staying calm, consistent, and meticulous wasn't just about personal pride, it was about survival. A damaged reputation could accelerate scrutiny and weaken his operational position. Isolation compounded the pressure. Fewer people were trusted to relay accurate information, which meant that gaps in perception could threaten both stability and reputation. Russo became increasingly selective about whom he engaged with, which reduced error but also narrowed input. The fewer the voices he trusted, the greater the weight of each decision. This self-imposed isolation magnified the responsibility of maintaining perception. The weight of reputation extended to legacy. Russo had ambitions beyond mere survival. He wanted to be remembered for influence, control, and precision. The stories people told about him, even quietly, shaped his enduring presence in the system. This desire for a durable reputation added another layer of pressure, merging personal pride with operational necessity. Every move became both tactical and symbolic. Communities indirectly felt the effects of this focus. Decision-making often prioritized perception over speed or direct benefit. Projects were executed meticulously but slowly. Opportunities for expansion or assistance were delayed in favor of ensuring actions reinforced Russo's credibility. Reputation demanded patience, and patience often came at the cost of immediate efficiency. The most critical lesson from this chapter is clear. In high-stakes systems, reputation is both armor and obligation. It protects, but it demands energy. It provides authority, but it requires vigilance. Russo's mastery of perception allowed him to survive pressures that would destroy less disciplined individuals, but it also trapped him within a constant cycle of self-monitoring. Even mastery has limits. Reputation can be undermined by forces beyond one's control, unexpected betrayals, changing perceptions, or shifts in the broader environment. Russo understood that no matter how careful, control over how others interpret one's actions is never absolute. Awareness, discipline, and adaptability are essential to prolong the strength of this intangible currency. By this stage in his life, Russo recognized the duality of reputation. It was a tool that extended his power and influence, but it was also a weight he could never set down. The balance between maintaining respect, projecting authority, and navigating unseen challenges demanded constant effort. One misstep, one misinterpreted action, could erode the hard-won confidence of associates and the credibility that kept rivals cautious. For viewers, this chapter illuminates a timeless truth. Authority and survival in complex systems depend as much on perception as on tangible resources. Managing the unseen aspects of influence, trust, respect, and reputation requires intelligence, patience, and discipline. When that management falters, even the most controlled systems show cracks. Andrew Russo remained outwardly composed, precise, and respected, but beneath the surface, the relentless pressure of preserving reputation, combined with the cumulative strain of unseen threats and narrowing choices, weighed heavily. Survival demanded vigilance, but maintaining influence required constant energy, a reminder that the most potent power often comes at the highest personal cost. Power is rarely static, especially in a world as intricate and layered as the one Andrew Russo inhabited. It does not exist in isolation. It moves, shifts, and responds to pressure both internal and external. For Russo, the slow shift of power was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. It did not announce itself with battles, betrayals, or public confrontation. Instead, it crept quietly through hesitation, changing loyalties and opportunities that went unclaimed. The early signs were minor. Associates who once deferred instantly now paused. Decisions that were once executed immediately were questioned, subtly negotiated, or delayed. Russo noticed the difference but did not panic. He understood that power is as much about perception as reality. These small shifts in behavior, however, were early indicators that the foundation of influence was being tested. Control had always been maintained through discipline, consistency, and strategic oversight. Russo had cultivated an environment in which efficiency and caution were rewarded, but the external environment was no longer static. Law enforcement methods became more sophisticated. Financial oversight improved. Rival groups adapted, experimenting with new ways to challenge the existing hierarchy. In a system designed for slow, deliberate operations, these external shifts introduced friction. Internal pressures compounded the challenge. The younger generation of associates was less deferential. They valued speed over tradition, results over process. Where Russo relied on patience and subtle influence, they sought immediate outcomes. This generational tension created an unseen, cumulative erosion of authority. Small acts of impatience or questioning, though not openly confrontational, chipped away at the perceived infallibility of leadership. Financial influence, a cornerstone of Russo's power, also faced subtle erosion. Revenue streams remained steady but were increasingly constrained. Clients tested boundaries. Opportunities required concessions that had once been unnecessary. Even minor concessions, when accumulated over months and years, gradually reduced the leverage Russo held. What had once been absolute control over agreements became negotiated compromise. Reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, was both a shield and a source of vulnerability. People still respected Russo's skill, composure, and discretion, but respect does not guarantee obedience. When power shifts slowly, even the most disciplined followers begin to question priorities, timing, and judgment. Loyalty remains, but it is tempered by pragmatism. Subtle questioning can become a habit, and habits eventually reshape dynamics. Isolation amplified the effect of these shifts. Russo had always relied on a tight circle of trusted individuals, but as operations narrowed and oversight increased, that circle shrank further. Decisions became concentrated in fewer hands. With fewer perspectives, misjudgments became more likely. Even the most calculated leader is vulnerable when dependent on limited feedback. The external perception of stability masked these internal shifts. Outsiders saw steady operations, reliable income, and disciplined organization. But stability without adaptability is brittle. The organization could operate day to day, yet fail to respond effectively to cumulative pressures. Russo recognized that appearance alone could not maintain influence indefinitely. Pressure from multiple directions forced difficult trade-offs. Every choice had consequences, every action carried risk. Expanding operations to seize opportunities increased exposure. Contracting to preserve safety risked appearing weak. Each adjustment narrowed options further. The careful balance Russo had maintained for years was now increasingly precarious. The slow shift of power also reshaped Russo's psychological landscape. Vigilance, which had once been a tool, became a constant strain. Awareness of subtle changes in loyalty, influence, and opportunity required sustained mental effort. Fatigue, even when invisible to outsiders, affected decision-making and risk assessment. The more he observed, the more apparent the shifts became. Communities and networks influenced by Russo's operations also felt these subtle changes. Projects slowed, delays accumulated, and negotiations became more complicated. The indirect consequences of shifting internal power affected people who were not directly involved. Change propagated outward quietly, showing how slow shifts in authority can ripple across systems in ways that are difficult to quantify but significant in impact. At this stage, Russo had to reconcile with the duality of power, the authority he commanded, and the fragility of that authority under slow, cumulative pressures. Influence depends on perception, but perception is shaped by others. Even the most disciplined leader cannot control every variable. The slow erosion of compliance, confidence, and initiative is more dangerous than sudden confrontation, because it unfolds unnoticed until consequences are unavoidable. For viewers, this chapter illustrates a key principle. Power is not fixed. It is dynamic. It is reinforced through trust, respect, and consistent demonstration of competence. Yet it can erode gradually under pressure. Observing subtle shifts, adapting to changing circumstances, and maintaining resilience are essential to sustaining influence in complex systems. Russo remained composed and calculated, yet beneath the surface, he was acutely aware of the shift. Decisions were now measured not only for immediate effectiveness, but also for their long-term impact on authority and influence. Each interaction became a test, each negotiation a microcosm of the broader dynamics at play. The slow shift of power is relentless because it is invisible to those untrained in observation. It forces a leader to evaluate every relationship, every decision, and every outcome with extreme care. For Andrew Russo, mastery of vigilance had delayed recognition of the erosion, but not its inevitability. Power is never permanent. It can be preserved, guided, and extended, but it cannot be stopped from moving in response to forces beyond control. The most important lesson from this chapter is the recognition that authority is a living system. It requires continuous adaptation. Stability is not the absence of change, it is the capacity to respond to it effectively. Russo's story demonstrates that even the most disciplined, careful, and capable individuals face the reality that influence shifts, often in subtle ways, long before visible consequences appear. Andrew Russo continued to operate with precision, awareness, and control, but the world around him was changing in quiet, cumulative ways. Each choice, each interaction, and each observation became part of a larger pattern, shaping the balance of power in ways that were invisible in the moment but profound over time. The slow shift of power had begun to define the trajectory of his operations, testing not only his skill but the very foundation of his influence. Control is a seductive force, but it comes at a price. For Andrew Russo, the price was both visible and invisible, immediate and cumulative. He had built his life on the ability to influence outcomes, maintain order, and minimize risk. Yet the very effort required to maintain that control extracted a toll, one that could not be measured in dollars or influence alone. The first cost was personal. Long hours spent managing operations, monitoring associates, and evaluating every possible risk created an unrelenting mental strain. Russo's mind was always active, constantly calculating, predicting, and anticipating. Sleep, when it came, was never restorative. Even during rest, subconscious attention lingered on conversations, decisions, and unseen variables. This continuous vigilance shaped behavior, personality, and mood, creating an internal environment that few outside could perceive or understand. Isolation accompanied this pressure. Trust was limited to a select few, and even then, relationships were transactional. People were valuable insofar as they could execute a role or maintain discretion. Emotional connection was secondary to operational necessity. Loneliness was not a complaint, it was a byproduct of survival. Yet its effects accumulated over time. Isolation magnified stress, reduced resilience, and intensified the mental burden of decision-making. The operational cost of control was equally significant. Russo's meticulous approach required constant monitoring of personnel, finances, and communications. Every process, no matter how small, demanded oversight. Delegation could reduce workload, but only to a point. Each layer added potential error and diluted authority. The more control he sought to maintain, the more effort it demanded. Paradoxically, control was both a protective mechanism and a consuming force. Financial decisions illustrated this principle clearly. Russo's cautious, deliberate strategies minimized exposure and ensured steady cash flow. But caution often limited opportunity. Aggressive expansion, riskier ventures, or high-reward operations were avoided in favor of stability. Over time, the system became conservative. Survival was maintained, but growth was constrained. The cost of control in this sense was the narrowing of possibilities. Socially, control influenced perception and interaction. People were careful around Russo, sometimes excessively so. Respect, compliance, and loyalty were often mixed with fear and hesitation. While this reinforced his authority, it also prevented authentic engagement. Subordinates were less likely to offer insight or initiative when they felt every action might be scrutinized. Over-reliance on control can suppress creativity, problem-solving, and adaptability, critical assets in an unpredictable environment. The cost extended to influence outside the immediate organization. Russo maintained connections, alliances, and partnerships with precision. Yet each interaction required careful calculation. Missteps could compromise relationships, attract scrutiny, or invite rivals to exploit vulnerabilities. The energy invested in maintaining these external perceptions was enormous, often invisible to those benefiting from the stability he provided. Legal and environmental pressures compounded the cost. Law enforcement was increasingly sophisticated, employing investigative methods Russo had never encountered in previous decades. Surveillance, financial analysis, and pattern recognition became tools that slowly eroded operational invisibility. Each decision, each interaction, carried a potential legal implication. Control was no longer just about operations, it was about avoiding exposure, minimizing risk, and protecting the system itself. Psychologically, the cost of control manifested as heightened vigilance. Every conversation, every financial move, every operational choice was examined for potential risk. Mistakes could be catastrophic, so Russo's focus sharpened continually. Attention to detail became a survival mechanism, but it also intensified stress and reduced mental bandwidth. Over time, the constant demand for precision created an invisible weight, pressing upon judgment and patience. The human element further amplified the cost. Associates had their own fears, ambitions, and pressures. Russo had to account for these variables constantly, anticipating reactions, mitigating dissent, and reinforcing loyalty. Leadership in such an environment required continuous observation and adaptation. The mental and emotional energy needed to maintain alignment was unceasing. Communities indirectly felt the effects of Russo's control. Projects moved steadily, but slowly. Opportunities were carefully vetted and often delayed. The system operated efficiently, but its rigidity limited responsiveness. People outside the inner circle may have interpreted this as methodical order, but in reality, it was the outcome of constant energy expended to maintain balance and prevent disruption. Control also demanded moral calculation. Decisions that protected operations sometimes came at the expense of others. Business loyalty and survival often outweighed ethics, creating moral tension. Russo balanced these considerations meticulously, but the internal cost remained. Awareness of harm caused by inaction or prioritization weighed silently on judgment, further complicating the mental burden. The ultimate cost of control is cumulative. It is not always visible in immediate results. Instead, it manifests as fatigue, isolation, rigidity, and narrow choices. Russo's survival and operational success were testament to his skill, but they also reflected the enduring strain of sustaining dominance over a complex, high-risk system. Mastery requires vigilance, but mastery also extracts a toll that is rarely acknowledged outside the inner circle. For viewers, the lesson is clear: control comes at a price. Whether in crime, business, or personal life, exerting dominance and influence requires energy, focus, and sacrifice. The benefits may be visible, but the costs, psychological, emotional, and operational, are often invisible, accumulating slowly until they become undeniable. Russo's story demonstrates that even the most skilled and disciplined individuals cannot maintain absolute control without paying the ongoing price of effort, isolation, and restraint. Andrew Russo's continued success depended not just on skill, intelligence, or opportunity, but on his capacity to endure the weight of control. Survival in this environment was less about dominance in the moment, and more about the ability to persist, adapt, and carry the cumulative burden over years, making decisions that preserved both operations and influence. Control was both a weapon and a weight, a paradox Russo carried with precision and resolve. Every system, no matter how carefully maintained, reaches a moment when small pressures accumulate into something greater, a tipping point. For Andrew Russo, this moment arrived not with a dramatic confrontation, but as a subtle convergence of internal tension, external threats, and cumulative fatigue. It was a shift that changed the dynamics of control, influence, and survival in ways that could no longer be ignored. Russo had spent years building a world in which order, discretion, and calculated influence dominated. Decisions were deliberate, risks minimized, and outcomes carefully managed. Yet the very systems that preserved stability also created fragility. The meticulous control he exercised over associates, finances, and operations had limited adaptability. Each layer of oversight, each precaution taken, made rapid change increasingly difficult. When the pressures, both seen and unseen, reached a certain threshold, the equilibrium that had taken years to maintain began to wobble. The first signs were subtle. Delays that had once been minor now compounded. Associates, previously reliable, became hesitant. Small mistakes, previously inconsequential, began to require disproportionate attention. Russo noticed these patterns and adjusted, tightening oversight, reinforcing discipline, and recalibrating expectations. Yet, as in every system, effort can only offset pressure temporarily. The forces pushing against him were relentless. External threats intensified the strain. Law enforcement surveillance increased, employing methods Russo had never fully encountered. Investigations were precise, patient, and sophisticated, targeting patterns rather than individual actions. Rivals, emboldened by perceived vulnerabilities, tested boundaries quietly, probing for weaknesses. Even minor lapses could now carry far-reaching consequences. Each day required renewed attention, with no margin for error. Internally, the human element added complexity. Loyalty, while still present, had become conditional. Ambition, impatience, and frustration surfaced subtly among associates. Where hesitation had once been safe, now it created risk. Where compliance had once reinforced authority, now it masked disengagement. Russo's awareness of these dynamics was acute, but observation alone could not fully prevent them from influencing outcomes. Financial constraints mirrored these pressures. Streams of income remained steady, but opportunities for expansion had narrowed. High-risk ventures were avoided, and even moderate opportunities required careful evaluation. The cautious strategies that preserved stability also limited growth. With each foregone opportunity, leverage diminished subtly, reducing Russo's ability to influence the broader environment. The psychological dimension of the tipping point was profound. Vigilance, which had once been a strength, now felt like constant strain. Every decision carried weight. Every delay invited uncertainty, and every misjudgment could amplify consequences. Fatigue was both mental and emotional. Even the most disciplined mind struggles when continuously subjected to stress without adequate release. Russo's composure remained intact externally, but internally, the weight of responsibility pressed relentlessly. The tipping point was also defined by narrowing options. Each choice Russo faced carried trade-offs that had compounding effects. Expanding operations risked exposure. Contracting limited leverage. Reacting to threats required attention that could have been spent on opportunity. With options constricted, every decision became more consequential, and the margin for error decreased dramatically. Associates felt the change, even if they could not articulate it. The environment became more rigid. Conversations shortened, initiatives slowed, and risk-taking diminished. Where once the organization could respond flexibly, now reactions were conservative, calculated, and delayed. The system continued to function, but its adaptability was weakened. The tipping point is also defined by perception. To outsiders, everything might still appear under control. The system seems orderly, stable, and efficient. But internal stress is invisible to those not involved. Momentum can continue, but resilience is eroded. Russo understood this paradox. The system could appear intact even as its structural integrity weakened. For communities indirectly affected by his operations, the consequences were subtle but noticeable. Decisions took longer. Opportunities were missed. Interactions became cautious, predictable, and slow. Harm did not arrive suddenly, it accumulated quietly. Stability, once protective, now limited responsiveness. The tipping point was not dramatic for those observing externally, but its effects were significant. The lesson embedded in this stage of Russo's story is critical. Sustained pressure, if unaddressed, eventually forces change, whether visible or not. Systems maintained through discipline, vigilance, and control are vulnerable to cumulative stress. The tipping point is less about dramatic disruption and more about the quiet convergence of stressors that overwhelm even the most resilient structures. Russo recognized the inevitability of this stage. Awareness of the tipping point does not prevent it, but it allows preparation. Leaders can reinforce systems, redistribute responsibility, and make strategic adjustments. Yet even preparation cannot eliminate the convergence of pressure entirely. There are limits to endurance, and the very mechanisms designed to protect can sometimes amplify fragility when stretched too far. Psychologically, the tipping point created a heightened sense of urgency. Russo's mind worked to anticipate every ripple of consequence. Every minor deviation became significant. Every lapse a potential crisis. The tension between action and restraint, risk and preservation, reached its peak. Decisions could no longer be postponed. Timing became critical. The cost of miscalculation had never been higher. The tipping point also revealed the limits of perception. Not all variables can be seen, not all risks anticipated. Unforeseen events, errors, betrayals, or chance circumstances can exploit even the most disciplined systems. Russo's experience demonstrates that mastery of a domain delays vulnerability, but it does not eliminate it. Success is not permanence, it is endurance under pressure. For viewers, this chapter illustrates a universal truth. No system, no matter how disciplined, controlled, or seemingly stable, is immune to cumulative stress. The tipping point is inevitable in complex environments. Awareness, vigilance, and adaptability can extend stability, but they cannot guarantee it. Recognizing the signs, anticipating consequences, and acting decisively are the only tools to navigate the convergence of pressures successfully. Andrew Russo stood at this critical juncture, aware that the equilibrium he had maintained for years was now under strain. The subtle shift of power, the narrowing of options, and the cumulative weight of responsibility converged to create conditions where every decision mattered profoundly. Control remained, but it was now a balancing act, precarious, demanding, and relentless. The tipping point had arrived, and with it came the realization that survival required more than discipline. It required courage, foresight, and the willingness to act decisively under pressure. Every life built on calculated control eventually encounters a moment when theory meets reality. For Andrew Russo, the moment of reckoning arrived not with fanfare or violence, but as a convergence of consequences, decisions, and hidden pressures that had been accumulating for years. It was the point where discipline, caution, and vigilance were tested against the unpredictable currents of circumstance. The system he had constructed, meticulous, efficient, and resilient, was now confronted by forces that could not be fully contained or anticipated. Russo had long understood that every action carried risk, every decision a hidden cost. Yet even the most disciplined strategist cannot eliminate the cumulative impact of time, fatigue, and human variability. Over the years, the balance between preservation and opportunity had narrowed. Decisions that once seemed prudent now carried weighty consequences. Errors of omission, delays, or hesitation could ripple outward, affecting associates, operations, and reputations simultaneously. The moment of reckoning demanded clarity and resolution. The first pressure was internal. His mind, accustomed to constant vigilance, felt strained in new ways. Fatigue had accumulated, not just physically but psychologically. Continuous anticipation of threats, monitoring of associates, and evaluation of strategy had created a mental landscape crowded with contingencies, probabilities, and hypothetical scenarios. Decision-making, once fluid and precise, now required deliberate mental calibration. Each choice demanded conscious prioritization. What could be addressed immediately, what could be delayed, and what required preemptive action to prevent escalation. Simultaneously, the external environment had become more complex. Rivals and competitors, once cautious and predictable, began to exploit opportunities quietly. Patterns that Russo had relied upon for decades no longer guaranteed control. Small challenges, subtle infringements on territory, or shifts in alliances were magnified because of the narrowing operational bandwidth. Each new complication had the potential to cascade, creating unforeseen consequences that tested the resilience of the system. Law enforcement pressure, always a constant, intensified. Investigative techniques had evolved. Pattern analysis, financial tracking, and indirect observation created a web of oversight that could identify vulnerabilities without ever relying on obvious mistakes. Russo's discretion remained formidable, but the margin for error had shrunk to near zero. The invisible pressure of surveillance transformed every decision into a potential point of exposure. Internally, the human factor remained the most unpredictable. Associates, while loyal in principle, had accumulated their own ambitions, frustrations, and fears. They operated under the awareness that the system's efficiency now depended heavily on their continued compliance. Minor lapses or hesitation could have magnified effects, undermining operational stability. Russo's leadership had always depended on subtle influence, calibrating authority, distributing responsibility, and observing behavioral cues, but in the moment of reckoning, even the most minor signals could have major implications. Financial stability, while steady, had its own pressure points. Opportunities for expansion or investment were constrained by risk aversion. Conservative strategies ensured survival but limited leverage against emerging challenges. In this phase, even small miscalculations, delayed negotiations, overlooked contracts, or slight errors in timing could trigger disproportionate operational consequences. Control, while still maintained, demanded precision beyond what was ever required in earlier, more expansive phases. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. Russo's awareness of risk, compounded by fatigue and environmental pressure, created an intense cognitive load. The mental effort required to maintain clarity, focus, and discipline was continuous. Every action had a ripple effect. Every decision carried the potential for unintended consequences, and every choice was scrutinized for hidden vulnerabilities. The toll was not external, it was internal, manifesting as persistent tension, heightened vigilance, and an unrelenting awareness of fragility. This period revealed a paradox of mastery. The greater the skill, the more delicate the system becomes under cumulative pressure. Russo's ability to anticipate, calculate, and adapt had allowed him to survive for decades, but mastery had also created a dependence on precision and control. The more refined the system, the fewer errors it could absorb without consequence. The moment of reckoning, therefore, was not a sudden crisis. It was the inevitable point where accumulated pressures tested even the most disciplined structures. Communities indirectly affected by Russo's operations felt the consequences subtly. Decisions became slower, processes more deliberate, and communication more guarded. Opportunities that might have brought benefit were deferred in favor of minimizing risk. The cost of control, which had once manifested as efficiency and stability, now manifested as rigidity and reduced adaptability. The moment of reckoning was not only a test for Russo, but for the network, systems, and people operating under his influence. The leadership challenge was compounded by moral considerations. Decisions required balancing operational preservation against human consequence. The longer Russo delayed action, the greater the potential cost to those dependent on him, yet premature or miscalculated actions could destabilize everything he had built. In high-stakes systems, morality, strategy, and survival are rarely perfectly aligned. Russo's choices reflected both strategic prudence and awareness of consequence, illustrating the intricate calculus of long-term leadership in high-pressure environments. Strategically, Russo approached this moment with the same principles that had guided his career: measured calculation, disciplined execution, and adaptive foresight. He evaluated threats, anticipated reactions, and prioritized interventions. Yet the scale and simultaneity of challenges created uncertainty. Even the most robust strategies could fail when confronted with cumulative and interacting pressures. This is the essence of a moment of reckoning, the collision of preparation with unpredictability. For viewers, the lesson is clear. Sustained control is never guaranteed. Systems, no matter how disciplined, face cumulative pressures that test resilience, judgment, and adaptability. Success is defined not by the absence of challenge, but by the ability to respond effectively under compounding stress. The moment of reckoning is inevitable. It is the point at which preparation, vigilance, and adaptability are tested to their limits. Andrew Russo's response exemplifies the qualities required to navigate this stage: patience, clarity, and unwavering attention to detail. Yet it also reveals the human cost of prolonged control. Fatigue, tension, and psychological pressure are inevitable companions for those maintaining complex, high-stakes systems over time. Endurance becomes as critical as skill. Success is less about dominance and more about navigating convergence, aligning preparation, adaptability, and decisiveness at the exact moment pressure peaks. By the end of this period, Russo had weathered the immediate challenges of the tipping point. The system remained functional, his authority intact, and operations continued. Yet the cumulative weight of responsibility, vigilance, and risk was undeniable. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and Russo had met it not with impulsive reaction, but with calculated precision, disciplined judgment, and an awareness of the subtle forces shaping outcomes. It was a reminder that survival in high-pressure systems is not guaranteed by skill alone. It is sustained by endurance, foresight, and the capacity to act decisively when pressures converge. Every life leaves a footprint, and every influence carries echoes beyond the immediate moment. For Andrew Russo, the final chapter of his journey was not defined by dramatic confrontation, explosive betrayal, or public recognition. It was defined by the quiet persistence of choices, the subtle shaping of systems, and the enduring consequences of decades spent mastering control in a world of risk. This was the legacy he would leave, not in headlines or fame, but in the structures, habits, and lessons that survived him. Russo had long understood the nature of influence. It is less about visibility and more about the subtle manipulation of systems and perceptions. Over the years, he had built a network capable of functioning quietly, efficiently, and with remarkable resilience. His operations moved like clockwork, largely unnoticed by outsiders, and carefully managed within. The appearance of calm and stability was not accidental. It was a result of constant vigilance, deliberate decision-making, and an understanding of human behavior at every level. In his later years, Russo reflected on the paradox of power. The stronger the control, the more isolated the individual becomes. His authority had been unchallenged in practical terms, yet the very act of maintaining dominance had created distance from associates, peers, and even personal connections. Loneliness, once abstract, had become palpable. Relationships were transactional, loyalty conditional, and trust carefully rationed. For all the security that control provided, it came at the cost of emotional connection. The influence Russo exerted, however, extended far beyond the immediate circle of associates. Communities shaped by his operations through employment, commerce, and protection felt the effects of his decisions for decades. Yet these consequences were often invisible, delays avoided through careful planning, conflicts mitigated before they escalated, opportunities constrained by caution. In these subtle ways, Russo's hand shaped not just people, but entire systems. His impact was silent, pervasive, and durable. Financially, Russo's legacy was remarkable in its efficiency. Assets were maintained, risks carefully hedged, and operations designed to outlast transient volatility. He avoided unnecessary exposure while maximizing long-term stability. The financial framework he built would endure beyond his personal involvement, allowing the systems he cultivated to continue functioning even in his absence. This structural foresight was an extension of the same principles that had guided his life: anticipation, precision, and the management of uncertainty. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of Russo's legacy was the intangible knowledge he carried. Decades of observing human behavior, evaluating risk, and navigating complex networks had created a mental map that few could rival. He understood not just mechanics, but psychology, the subtle motivations, fears, and ambitions that drive people. That awareness allowed him to maintain influence, predict reactions, and manage volatility with a deftness that often went unnoticed. Knowledge, in Russo's world, was as powerful as money or authority. Even in retirement or in the quieter phases of his life, the lessons of vigilance persisted. He recognized that influence is never permanent, that circumstances evolve, and that control, no matter how absolute it seems, must be continuously maintained. Yet he also understood that legacy is not about constant oversight. It is about the systems and behaviors instilled in others that persist when direct supervision is no longer possible. Ethically, Russo's life was a complex study in consequences. Decisions that preserved operations sometimes caused harm indirectly. Balancing survival with moral consideration was a constant challenge. Yet his careful calculation reflected a principle he had embraced early: action without foresight is dangerous, inaction without judgment is fatal. He had accepted that leadership in high-stakes systems inevitably involves difficult choices, decisions, where there is no perfect outcome, only the most strategic path. The lesson for those observing his life is profound. Mastery over complex systems is achieved through a combination of skill, patience, foresight, and resilience. Power is not simply exerted, it is maintained through discipline, observation, and adaptability. Influence is not claimed, it is earned and reinforced continually. Russo's life demonstrates that the most effective control is often quiet, deliberate, and invisible, but it is never effortless. As the final years passed, Russo focused increasingly on mentorship and guidance for those he deemed capable of understanding and sustaining his systems. He shared principles, strategies, and frameworks rather than direct control. By teaching others how to observe, evaluate, and respond, he ensured that his influence would persist without requiring constant intervention. This approach transformed legacy from a matter of possession into a matter of continuity, a system that could endure independent of his personal involvement. The physical trappings of his operations, the offices, the ledgers, the infrastructure, were less significant than the mental frameworks and behavioral patterns he instilled in others. Russo understood that human systems, unlike material assets, are inherently adaptive. They can survive, evolve, and even thrive beyond the individual's presence, provided that they are grounded in sound principles and disciplined practices. His legacy, therefore, was not monuments or accolades, but the durability of the systems he had shaped and the behavioral intelligence he had imparted. The reflective moments of Russo's life were quiet, almost meditative. He considered the cost of control, the weight of responsibility, and the isolation that accompanied authority. Yet there was no regret, only recognition of the inevitability of trade-offs. Survival, influence, and long-term impact had come at the expense of ease, comfort, and personal connection. Every choice had been deliberate, every outcome anticipated, and every consequence evaluated. For viewers, the ultimate takeaway is twofold. Mastery and endurance are inseparable, and influence leaves its most enduring mark not in spectacle, but in subtle, sustained impact. Russo's life demonstrates that control, when exercised with intelligence and foresight, can create systems that outlive the individual. Yet it also demonstrates the human cost of such mastery, the psychological weight, the isolation, and the constant vigilance required. In the end, Andrew Russo's legacy was a testament to the quiet power of discipline, observation, and strategic foresight. He shaped systems that endured, influenced people who carried forward his principles and navigated pressures that would have overwhelmed less disciplined individuals. His story is a reminder that survival in complex, high-stakes environments depends on more than courage or a skill that requires patience, adaptability, and the unrelenting pursuit of understanding. The final lesson embedded in this story is universal. Power, influence, and legacy are inseparable from responsibility, foresight, and the human cost of maintaining control. True mastery leaves a footprint not in fame, but in enduring systems, subtle guidance, and lessons that persist quietly, shaping the world long after direct action has ceased. Andrew Russo's life, lived in the shadows, exemplifies that principle, demonstrating the delicate balance between control, consequence, and the enduring impact of thoughtful, disciplined leadership.